As job moves have become more frequent, what the average now is 4.1 years in a role, at least to us, there's a greater distinction between the workplace and the move, because the move is a phenomenon in and of itself. And the data is therefore different. If you focus on studying the workplace, you'll understand many forces that matter, but those will be potentially different than the forces that are at work when someone is actually in a move. And most of the surveys that have existed before to try and understand both of those things do it as one. And by disaggregating it, our data set became rather unique in that we focused purely on the switches, because that's one of the ways in which people are making progress in their careers today, given how frequently they do it.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Why do employees really quit? We face significant switching costs when we leave one job for another. There's the uncertainty about the new organization. We're leaving behind friends. We need to figure out this new job and this new company. It's not easy. And yet, an estimated billion people switch jobs every year. Is it just about the money? If I'm designing work, I'd want to know why. So I was very excited to speak with Ethan Bernstein and Michael Horn, two authors, Harvard educators, and researchers who have gone deep on this issue through their latest book, Job Moves. They argue that unless companies evolve their approach to the design of work, they'll continue to lose their top talent, a fate that is entirely preventable. By applying job-to-be-done theory, Ethan and Michael analyze jobs not just as positions, but as roles we hire to help us progress in our lives and our careers. In this episode, Ethan, Michael, and I talk about the major pushes and pulls driving job changes, jobs-to-be-done theory applied to work and career transitions, and progress versus progression at work. We also discuss the four motivators or quests behind employees switching jobs, the importance of experiences versus features in job selection, activities companies can do to ensure employee fit, prototyping and testing potential career changes, as well as other topics. As always, we ask you to continue to support Work for Humans by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, I'm excited to bring you my conversation with Ethan Bernstein and Michael Horn. Ethan Bernstein, Michael Horn, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's wonderful to be here with you, Dart.
I'm incredibly excited about your work. So, first of all, congratulations on your article in the Harvard Business Review, which is Why People Quit, and your upcoming book, which is Job Moves. We're going to dig into both of those today. What I find so exciting about your work is that you have come at the same problem space that I've been after, but by asking subtly different things with a subtly different framing, we have illuminated different corners of the same room. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is how that happened, how that works, and then what your recommendations are.
Perfect.
It's nice to be together, when you share the spotlight in HBR with someone else and you don't know what those articles are until suddenly the HBR comes out, and then all of a sudden we get to have this conversation together. That's wonderful.
I know. And it was a very interesting thing because it's a spotlight section in the Harvard Business Review. And so what that means is it's all people who are interested in very much the same topic. And so I was like, oh my gosh, my brothers and sisters are all right here who I'd never known before. I hadn't known you both before.
Yeah. And I had been talking with Christoph Martel, who, when he saw our work, he said, you have to connect with Dart because you all are reframing this question from such a similar perspective. You're just going to get on. And so here we are.
Yes. Christoph has been on the show, and I always love talking to him. What problems or questions did you set out to solve when you started this research?
Ethan, why don't you tell the origin story of how you first delved into this in 2009? Because I think that's a really interesting place to start to answer that question.
And I think there's a related question too, which is how did you all come together? Because you're not exactly from the same discipline. How did you even find each other and say, we have something to do together here, which includes Bob Mesta, by the way. And Bob Mesta is one of the co-inventors of job-to-be-done theory. So clearly one of my heroes.
it all comes down to a fourth individual who's not in the room. It comes down to Clay Christensen. He was one of my dissertation advisors. He's a co-author and mentor for Michael, and he's a co-author and mentor for Bob. And Clay was, in my view, frustrated when he saw out there in the world things that just didn't make sense, that didn't have to be that way, that wasted people's time, effort, energies. Organizations wasted their own energies because the theory wasn't right. And so if you want the origin story or the motivation, I guess let's start with the motivation. The motivation is a lot of people switch jobs every year. Many of them end up not happy where they moved to. They disrupt their lives, they disrupt their careers, sometimes they disrupt their families' lives to make that move. And when they fail to find the right destination and they end up doing it again, it's that same feeling of frustration I have about that Clay had about product innovation that failed. It just seems like we should be able to do better. That's the motivation. And then the origin story comes to that trajectory just happened in my life by chance one day, by serendipity. I was giving career advice to a bunch of MBAs in the morning. In the afternoon, Clay had asked me to come and see Bob Mesta, who I'd never met, do a Jobs Done interview of a customer who'd bought a product to show me why Jobs Done theory made sense, why people hired products to make progress in their lives rather than just buying a product. I sat in that classroom. I watched Bob be an investigative journalist for 60 minutes, probing deeply to understand the causation for why that consumer had purchased a product, had hired that product for a job to be done. I stood up at the end and thought, wow, I should have done that this morning when I gave career advice. I would have been so much better at that because I would have gotten at the question of why did they hire that next job in their lives to make progress in their careers, as opposed to just organizations hiring them, which I know is language dart that's familiar to you. It took me until 2009, though, to get there.
It is definitely familiar. And also to my listeners who hear about it all the time. What brought the three of you together? I mean, besides, so there's Clay, but how did you even find each other and say, oh, no, we should do this together?
Ethan, out of that conversation that he got to see, started to build a course that actually explored more deeply why do individuals hire their roles and their jobs, which gave him and Bob the opportunity on at least an annual basis to start collaborating with each other and doing these interviews, not just on students, but students doing it on alums of the course and alums of HBS who are out in the wider world. And Bob and I simultaneously were applying the idea of Jobs to be Done about why do people choose to go to college? And so we wrote a book called Choosing College together. And the three of us were talking obviously during this time, but the real aha for me was, so I co-founded the Clayton Christensen Institute. I had run it for about a decade. And then I had stepped aside and I got a job offer while we were writing Choosing College to go be a university president. And Bob interviewed me and we reached the conclusion that it was a terrible idea for me to take this job because I was still in the very same job to be done, if you will. We now call it Quest, of why I had left full time for the Christensen Institute in the first place. And as a result of that, I think I avoided a pretty big career mistake that sounded great on paper, but for my actual reality would have been a mistake. And so when Clay Christensen passed away, the three of us became even more in touch because around funeral, things of that nature. And the three of us all had different pieces, if you will, of this elephant. And we said, to honor Clay, it's not just good enough to think about this. We need to put it out there in a form that other people can benefit from.
And it came together almost naturally, almost organically, Michael, right? Bob has invented more products than any other person I know of on the planet. Michael is an education guru and an upskilling expert who's written books before. I've never written a book before, by the way. And I developed this course that had all this material that had been tested with hundreds of individuals, but required me or somebody to be in the room with somebody to help them through it. And we thought if we kept our promise, it was at some point a promise to Clay before he passed away, to write this book, then maybe the impact of all three of those pieces would come together in a way that wouldn't always require us to be there to deliver the impact that we thought these ideas and these activities could have.
That makes so much sense. And Michael, I hadn't thought of the connection between essentially what I hire my job to do for me, or my next job to do for me, and what I hire college to do for me. When I was looking at your historical work, I hadn't made that connection. So that makes a ton of sense. So you went into this research with a very grounded approach, which is, let's not have an opinion. Let's just listen. Now, I'll just say, I've done that. Try as I might, I have a hard time not having an opinion. I have an opinion. But you did. You went in with this grounded approach. Let's just listen for a long time and hear what emerges. Were you surprised by what emerged?
I'll speak for myself first because the approach really is hypothesis seeking, and it's this humility that we are not smart enough to understand people's lives on the ground as they are led and to understand emerging priorities and circumstances and struggles, right? And so the protocol, the jobs to be done interview protocol that Bob has created is really that. It's hypothesis seeking. It's trying to understand, and sort of it's emergent in that way. Ethan, I'll let you jump in with whether you were surprised, but I think I was surprised that over 1,000 plus people, the forces that come together to cause them to switch are remarkably more common than I think I had expected on the front end. And Dart, I'll tell you, I had made some assumptions beforehand that actually some of the jobs to be done that cause adults to say, today's the day I'm going to go get more education, I'm going to go back to college, I'm going to go to a boot camp, an apprenticeship, whatever it might be. I thought that there would be some crossover into the world of jobs. I was both surprised where that crossover was and where that crossover wasn't, if that makes sense. There were some that showed up in certain elements of the quests that we discovered, and there's some that I expected to be there that are actually not present in the data at all, which was really interesting to me.
As a researcher in the field of organizational behavior who typically does qualitative research, for me, this was very comfortable at the beginning because we had a validated protocol that admittedly we were adapting to a different environment in which it hadn't been validated, but usually we can do that without too much concern in the academic world. So to me, this was a rigorous way of utilizing the research methods that I've been trained in and I've used for years on a new space. So that felt very comfortable. Where the surprises came for me, one was, as Michael suggested, I was surprised that all this clustered down to 30 pushes and pulls. I expected there to be more diversity, more variety, more variation. It would be harder, in fact, perhaps even impossible. Sometimes that happens to us as qualitative researchers. It's impossible for us to really code down into something that has meaning at the end. And that wasn't the case. It was actually relatively easy compared to some of my other qualitative research to get down to these 30 pushes and pulls. The second surprise, frankly, was how easily concepts of new product development were able to be applied to concepts of leadership self-development in careers. I thought there would be much more, what's the analogy here? How do we try to make the translation work? Will people understand it? Admittedly, not everyone did understand it. We wanted to title this book, Hire Your Next Job, and the publisher said, no, for many people, they won't understand what that means. And we actually say that in the third paragraph, I think, of the introduction. But it translated much more easily than I expected. So that was my second surprise.
If we'd just been listening to you, Dart, in your TED Talks and keynotes, we would have said, oh, gee, here's someone else who already realized this. We just have to crib a little bit.
But I will tell you it's not true. And I'll tell you why subtly different questions are coming up with subtly different answers. I have been very focused on work as a product that somebody is already using. And what are the design attributes that we might be able to derive from what they are hiring their existing work to do? Now, you have focused very much on what are people hiring their next job to do. And I like this a lot, which is that a lot of what people want from their job, when I ask the question the way I do, is static. It's these attributes of the work that they're going to get. But you're looking at a verb. You're looking at a flow, which is not just what do people want, but what motivates people? What are the pushes that are going to push somebody away from something? And what are the pulls that are going to pull them someplace else? And when framed that way, which I think both questions are important, but there is a much more direct business effect to people leaving a job and taking another one. I think they're both direct effects, but certainly one of them is more visible. So I think it's different and additive. Also, let me say.
Yeah, it's so interesting because Ethan and I'll pull back the curtain of our preparation for this, which was one of the emails we exchanged. I said, Ethan, this to me is the key distinction between the work that we have. And it's this exact same thing that you've honed in on, Dart. So we're remarkably same wavelengths on finding the differences as well. And I agree. We focused on the switch, and I'll tell you why we did in a moment. And yours is really on, I'm in the job. What do I want from it? And I love the way you don't settle for the surface level answers either. Someone says more money, you're asking why, right? To figure out, okay, what are you going to use it for? Why right now is that important? Which has a lot of similarities to the point where we did. And I think the reason we focused on the switch comes from, as Ethan said, the protocol that's been validated over time. What we've learned about it is it's really only valid, the jobs to be done protocol specifically, right? Not yours. It's only valid when you can actually observe a switch in behavior that the individual had agency over, that they made a choice, in other words. And Bob's famous line that he hates now, but Ethan and I love it, is bitchin' ain't switching. We complain all the time, but it doesn't actually motivate change in behavior. And so the jobs to be done is really trying to understand what causes you to switch or change behavior or hire that next job, hire that product you bought.
Okay. I love that.
I would only add that I think as job moves have become more frequent, what the average now is 4.1 years in a role in the United States, or maybe even globally, and it keeps coming down, at least to us, there's a greater distinction between the workplace and the move, because the move is a phenomenon in and of itself. And the data is therefore different. If you focus on studying the workplace, you'll understand many forces that matter, but those will be potentially different than the forces that are at work when someone is actually in a move. And most of the surveys that have existed before to try and understand both of those things do it as one. And by disaggregating it, our data set became rather unique in that we focused purely on the switches, because that's one of the ways in which people are making progress in their careers today, given how frequently they do it.
And it makes a lot of sense, which is this idea of bitchin' ain't switching. I love that. Bob doesn't like it. Well, I'm going to attribute it to him from now on. So
Yeah, I do every day. So
yeah. So there's a couple of things in there. One thing I found when I started the jobs to be done work is I thought I was getting everything, and then I realized that I wasn't, because jobs to be done identifies value in a product, but it doesn't identify cost. And so I started asking people the second question, which is, what does your job cost you? And to me, you've absolutely delineated those two things by talking about what pushes you away from one job. To some extent, it's the costs. And what attracts you to another, to some extent, it's the values. And so it's another place where I think we're saying very similar things, but because you're looking at the movement, the action, the behavior, it's coming out slightly differently.
That's precisely right, Dart. And then, of course, the second half of the jobs done theory says that when the anxiety of a new solution and the habit of the present are strong enough, they keep people from actually making a move. There has to be sufficient alignment between those pushes, those costs, and those pulls, those values, as you're putting it, such that the alignment overcomes the anxiety of the new solution and the habit of the present. And so we're only studying the people for whom that was true, which means we're only studying a small portion of the population, but that small portion of the population is going to include everyone on average every 4 or so years.
Right. And then the part that I think is distinct in there is I make a decision every minute in my job about whether or not I'm going to pay attention. And so there's the big decision of job switch, but then there's the small decision, which is much harder to observe. It's very convenient, by the way, that we use the word pay for attention. Accident of English. But one of the things we pay to acquire our job is attention. And so there is this small event. It's much more hidden and much harder to study, I suspect.
I'd love to connect these even further. And I never thought of it till you just said that. But in the jobs to be done timeline, so as we understand how people make switch, right? There's a first thought, passive looking, second thought, active looking, and then there's a decision, et cetera, right? So you go through this. The moment you hire, you make the big change. We actually, in the jobs to be done world, call that the big hire. So you bought the phone, right? And then once you've made the big hire, the question is, how do you in fact use that? And we call that the little hires. So I bought a new shirt. How many times do I actually pull it out of the closet and put it on? I switched jobs. How many times do I actually engage with the work or do I disengage and cut out? Right. And so what occurs to me is we've studied the big hire. You're studying all the little hires that, frankly, are far more numerous and ultimately can add up, right, to another big hire down the road. But I think it's actually all one big continuum that now, as we start to piece this together, we realize we're just looking at different parts of an employee's timeline.
I'm learning so much. That is such a useful idea of the big hire and the little hire. I just sold my boat. Why did I sell it? Well, the big hire was buying it and I used it a ton, but then I stopped using it. I started unsubscribing to it because I get seasick, it turns out. And after a while, it was just sitting in the driveway. And so I had a big sale. It makes a lot of sense to me. So we're going to get on to findings. You identify 4 quests. And actually, this is really fundamental, I think, that the 4 quests are the jobs that people hire a job change to do for them, is what I'm going to say. That's the way I'm going to articulate that. And so, what are those 4 quests? And what do they mean? And did I describe that right?
You described it exactly right. Maybe I'll run through the 4 quests quickly, and then Ethan, maybe you'll describe how we take the forces and move to them in their poles, if that makes sense, rather than absolutes. When we pull out from these pushes and pulls that cluster together in certain combinations, we saw 4 dominant clusters, shall we say. And these are the quests or the jobs to be done, exactly as you said. So one is get out. These are people who are saying, the way I'm managed, the role that I have, the place that I work, it's a dead end. It's not working for me. I feel beaten down and I just need to get out of here, right? To a place where I can do better work. I need to reset what I'm doing and how I do it. The second quest is almost the inverse of that, which we call take the next step. So these are people who are actually very engaged in what they do and how they do it, but they have a career or personal milestone and they're ready to take the next step in their careers. This often looks like the career ladder or progression, but not always. But it is that next logical step. The third one we found is what we call regain control. So these are people that like what they're doing, but they don't like how it's using their time or energy. And so they're looking to reset on that dimension and regain control of how their work interacts with their life or how they use their time in the job. And then the fourth one is what we call regain alignment. And these are individuals who actually like how they're working, but they don't like what they're being asked to do. They're feeling disrespected because the skill sets that they bring are not being used or understood or appreciated, or they're becoming known for things that aren't the things that they really want to be doing. And so they're seeking to regain alignment in their career.
And so some of the listeners at this point might be saying, well, hold on there. It sounds like I might be a combination of those. And so it's important to understand that these quests are actually just poles on a map for us. They're north, south, east, and west. They're not categorical. You can be somewhere in between any one of these. In fact, all we would do, even if you came to our assessment at jobmoves.com to try and figure out what quest you're on using the pushes and pulls, is tell you a likelihood that you're on one or the other. And then you have to figure out where in that map you are. And that map is largely laid out the way Michael just said. So if you are trying to reset the capabilities that the job takes advantage of, asks you to perform and utilize the skills upon which you deliver your product or your value. If you're trying to reset that, then you're trying to regain alignment. That's the what. If you're trying to reset how you're managed, maybe it's the way your manager manages you. Maybe it's that you just have something change at home. You have a new family, so you want to work a little bit less or more flexibly. You're an empty nester, and so you want to turn up the dial and work more. You didn't commute during the pandemic, and you discovered that when you have to go back to commuting, you're wasting 2 hours a day, and no one's giving you credit for that. These are all hows. And in that sense, you want to reset the way in which the job drives your energy. That's regaining control. And if you're trying to do both of those things, you're getting out. And if you're trying to do neither of those things, you're trying to build on both of the way it currently works, you're taking the next step. And you can be anywhere in that map, depending on what your current circumstances are.
And you've made a distinction between these quests that are progress versus that are progression. What is the difference between progress and progression?
Organizations, at least organizations that found themselves losing a lot of talent during the Great Resignation, we're offering progression. Mostly take the next step opportunities. Ethan, don't leave now. Wait around. The next step is right around the corner for you. You'll move up the ladder, another step. Then a couple years or 3 or 4 or 5 years after that, we can imagine you doing this and then that. And then someday your destination will be somewhere up in the organization. They have literally a ladder planned out for me, and that's a progression. It's what's being offered. Progress is what I actually want to achieve, the progress I actually want to make. Just like when Clay talked about hiring your next job, it was for a struggling moment that you were trying to make progress through, and the product provided the opportunity for me to make the progress past the struggling moment to a new way of doing things, a new idea of how it could be done. And the purchase of that product, the hiring of that product allowed me to achieve it. That's the progress I'm trying to make. It's much more multifaceted than that traditional ladder. And when there's enough of a distinction between progression, what's on offer, and progress, what I want to make, now basically it's like walking into a restaurant, discovering I don't like anything on the menu, so I walk out and go down the street to another restaurant. Now I'm finding a way to match the progress I want to make with the progression that's being offered to me.
So I think there's a very related point that you make in the book, which is when people are thinking about switching, they should think about experiences, not features. What is the difference?
Yeah. So features really are the attributes, if you will, of a job. Your pay, vacation, benefits, the title, things of that nature. They're the perks or the accoutrements, if you will, of how we label a job. Experiences are really your day-to-day and week-to-week things that you're actually doing, the INGs, if you will, the verbs of the job. What are the actual things that you're doing, and how does it interact with your situation, with your home life, with other parts of your desires in your career? And the big argument is both are important, to be clear, but you can't figure out which features are really important to you right now if you don't have a really sound understanding of the experiences you crave as you're making progress in your career.
And one way to think about this is titles are what people get to be. They don't do at all a job of describing what it is you're going to do. Doing is the experience. Being is the feature.
So let's talk about the traditional tool set that companies have to attract and retain, because it seems to me that they are very feature-oriented and less experience-oriented.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'll defer to Ethan in a moment, but I think this is another place where there's a really interesting intersection of your work and our work, because a lot of the things that they can do easily, right? I'll give you the bonus. I'll give you a little bit more time off. I'll bring in lunch on Fridays. Things like that that are much more about those features are divorced from, gee, these are the skill sets that you really want to be developing in your career, the competencies, capabilities that you want to be working on. Maybe I can actually start to say, okay, let's divide your role in this way and start to give you this set of assignments and rethink how we mix and match the experiences so that it meets the progress you're trying to make, but also importantly is helping us as an organization have the most engaged employee who's going to execute the things that matter most to us as well, and lean into where your strengths and energies really are.
I'd offer a caveat, though. I agree, Dart, that in general, the organizational toolkit privileges features over experiences, but that there's an important caveat. I think good, and especially great managers, don't. And so let me give you a story here. I had a guest in my classroom at the Harvard Business School. She's one of our graduates. She is currently the CEO of one of the most important organizations in the world. And she said to the students, as we talked about development, career development, that titles offer a great return to ego, but that is short-lived. What really matters is the opportunity to make progress. And progress is not captured in titles. Progress is captured in this case, a development plan that she was on for a decade or more, that a former CEO of that organization had worked out with her, that gave her a path to develop herself in ways that might make her ready for the top job, and ultimately seems to have done so. But that was not about the titles. It was actually about the capabilities and the energy drivers and drains that she herself had articulated wanting in order to achieve the path that she was seeking.
I'll tell you how I say that A lot of times when we're in a job, we very much think about what's the doorway we want to go through to get to the next title or to the next level or something like that. But when you're designing a house, you don't spend a ton of time designing doorways. You design rooms because that's where the experience is going to actually happen.
We actually love that example because it relates directly to something Ethan came up with pretty early when we were doing the book proposal. So I'm going to let you share the story, Ethan, about real estate listings and how that relates.
It based off of, I think, work that Clay would have done. But when we're in the market for a house and we look at the listings, it offers us all these features: granite countertops, open kitchens, et cetera, et cetera. No one buys a house because they get to go in and feel the granite countertop. They buy it so that they can cook in the kitchen and have conversations with the people around them. That's why they want an open kitchen with light granite countertops. It's all about the experiences. And if you try to buy a house off the feature set, you're probably going to be selling that house pretty soon. It's not going to last because, as you say, it's not about the doorways, it's about the rooms. And it's not about the things in the room. It's about how you're going to use them.
Bob, actually, one of the businesses he started was a house building business outside Detroit. And it was for people who were looking to downsize at the end of their lives. And what he found was that people, when he did the big kitchens and granite countertops and things like that, he couldn't get anyone to buy it. And they would come in and just say, talk about the dining room table over and over and over again. He was like, what the heck is it with the dining room table? And what he ultimately realized was that for the people he was talking to, the dining room table was where all the memories had been built in their house with their families over holidays. And he realized, actually, at this stage of their life, it's not about the kitchen. It's about they're not ready to part with the dining room table. So he made the dining room a little bit bigger so these tables could fit. He made the kitchens a little bit smaller, which was against conventional wisdom, but it was in their situations. And the houses started flying.
That is so beautiful. That is so beautiful. We upgraded our kitchen table recently, and I was so sad to see the old one go.
There you go.
Because the children grew up at that ugly old table that was made out of recycled pallets. But that was our table, you know? Now our table is very pretty. So relate that to job postings. So the way companies typically recruit and the way they typically advertise, since you were just talking about real estate listings.
We could start with the artifacts. How companies hire and how managers hire, I don't think is always captured in the artifacts that people see in the process of a job posting. But Michael and I share a distaste for job descriptions that incorporate everything that could possibly be on we're just talking about kitchens. The kitchen sink gets included. Job postings that Michael, we each have our favorites, but things like entry-level job, 5 years worth of work experience required. The job description, which is a key artifact, by the way, of the posting these days, is really designed to allow the hiring manager to have complete latitude and not get in trouble legally when they pick whoever it is they decide to pick through the hiring process. That's the artifact's purpose, and yet many people are using the job description as an indication for what the job requires, which is unfortunate because they think, therefore, that the organization is looking for a unicorn. You can't possibly have all those traits and be ready for this job as it's described, which of course then the other artifact of this matching process is the resume. What do we all do? We make our resume look so impressive based on everything we've ever done that we can meet the unicorn expectation and look like superheroes. It's a sales process, isn't it? Unfortunately, in my view, and I think in our view, it's a sales process in which the organization is trying to sell the organization to the person, and the person is trying to sell themselves to the organization. And I have nothing against sales, but what I want to achieve is a fit, a match, not a sale. And so the organizations and managers that do this well actually don't rely on these key artifacts, the job posting, et cetera, of the job hiring process. Instead, they're creating a shadow job description, really interacting with the individuals ahead of time to try and make sure they know what they're going to be doing, not being in this job. They're doing all of these things, and it feels like workarounds, but actually our encouragement is to make that core. It's not going to replace, we'd love to replace the job description. I don't think the lawyers are going to let us. But it's actually the core part of making a move successful, not the artifacts that you're probably referencing.
On this show, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company builds and delivers to employees. This struck a nerve. Work for Humans is in the top 5% of podcasts worldwide. And along the way, people began to approach us, asking us how they could put multi-sided management into practice. And they were from all walks of business, line managers and CEOs, 3-person startups and multinationals and universities. But they all shared in common the belief that management practices of the last century are clearly not working. In response to this demand, I've pulled together a small team of some of the best people I have ever had the privilege to work with during my long career, who are also passionate about multi-sided management. And we formed a company 11-fold to serve the need. If you want your employees to feel more alive at work, you want happier teams, lower turnover, and you want tools that traditional management failed to give you to balance the needs of the company and the needs of your teams, let's talk. Employees give your company value it cannot survive without. When you fail to design great work, they will unsubscribe, either by leaving or even worse, by losing the ability to care. Join us at 11fold.com, spelled 11FOLD. Let's change management.
This matching process that we've designed, as Ethan said, it's about flow. How many applications did you get and so forth? And it's sort of, we've automated the artifacts that in many ways now with AI and other things that are ancillary. And I think what good managers do often, as Ethan said, is they create these shadow job descriptions, but they also meet people and use network to find trusted individuals. And so the social part of this is so, so important. And it's how we almost get around the artifacts to find someone we think is a good fit. And network is incredibly important. And it has obviously a deep inequity for those who lack that social capital or awareness of how this is how things are actually working.
I have a whole episode coming up on social capital and networks. So that fits
fun.
in.
Okay.
Fits in really well. That's with David Obstfeld.
Oh,
Okay.
say hi to him for me.
I will.
He's a good friend.
Oh, well, he's an incredibly articulate human being, I'll tell you. And nice to me because I didn't hit record the first time and he still did it again.
It happens.
I have hit record. I just want you to know.
I can see it's uploading, so I know it's working.
I know, it's good. Well, this brings us to the 9 activities, I think. To the 9 activities that companies can do to ensure fit, not just minimum feature match, but actual thriving and durable flourishing. So let's talk about the 9 activities.
Essentially, the 9 steps are for the individual to figure out what's the progress you really want to make and how do you tell that story so you can find a great fit. And the encouragement for the organization or the manager specifically is to help people go through this so that you're making sure you're finding fit on both sides. And I'll run through it quickly, but the first one is to really understand, why'd you make the switch in the first place to show up here? We want to interview you to understand what were the forces at play, the quest that you're on that caused you to hire this particular role, this particular job. And with that understanding in place, what we want to constantly be doing is understanding, okay, what really drives your energy and which of those are the really important things that really give you the sense of progress? And what are the capabilities you want to be investing in and developing over time? And which ones of those are crucial? And importantly, these change over time, right? In terms of relative weights, what's important to us or not. But if, as the manager, if we're having that conversation constantly with the employee, we can be on the same page with each other.
The energy drivers and drains, this is a traditional exercise. We're borrowing things that we know work out there and adding them into our framework. The capabilities exercise is a little bit different, just to clarify for listeners. This is not strengths and weaknesses. In my world, or in the psychology world, strengths and weaknesses sound more like traits than states. And the truth of it is, most people, as they think about developing their career and making progress, are trying to remain relevant for the next role they take, or even perhaps the role they're staying in. That relevance is not just based on strengths and weaknesses. It's also based on what you're investing in to make yourself relevant, the assets that you are building and the liabilities you're incurring, usually in time and money, to do so. And so we take people through an exercise that's more focused on those assets and liabilities and less focused on strengths and weaknesses in order to get them to their quest.
I'll tell you where that really plays into some interviews from the past, some episodes from the past. I've had Joe Pine on the show twice, who wrote The Experience Economy. And he talks about products as experiences, but he's extended his model to transformations. And the definition of a transformation is that the outcome of me consuming a transformation product is me. I'm different. And so I saw that a lot in your research, which is that some of the things are experiences that people want to acquire, and some of them are transformation offerings that are going to make them new.
And to some extent, that's why the next step is to name your quest. How you interpret the exercises, for that matter, whether advice someone might give you is good or bad, is highly dependent upon which quest you're on. And we're not quest per person, so most of us will see all 4 quests and things in between over the course of our lives. But at any given time, we're on one of those quests. And so how you interact with a person is really dependent upon what quest they're on. And that's why the 4th step has to be to name the quest, because at that point, then we can start thinking about the next steps beyond that. Michael, you want to go step 5?
Sure. And this gets to the point where someone's looking for that next thing or looking to redefine their current role, right, in a way that's more in line with their progress. And to be clear, both can happen. But this is where we encourage people to create divergent prototypes, several different visions of what you could do next. One of those is, frankly, your current job or the next step in the organization. But we want you to create 3 to 5 very different visions of what you could go do next. Because as we like to say, contrast is going to help create meaning for you. The differences are going to help illuminate which of the energy drivers or which of the assets, as Ethan just said, that you could invest in are most important to you right now. Because we want to acknowledge, and in my world, we call this growth mindset. We want to acknowledge that we're changing people that are growing, and what I cared about or wanted to invest in at an early part of my career, chances are it changes as we move through it.
This is one of the things I love about the process that you describe, is that like a good design process, it has a prototype phase. And it has a phase where you brainstorm these alternatives and compare them. It is a not explicit part of your book that you are asking people to engage in a design cycle for the thing that they're going to craft and co-create with their employer now and in the future. So it's not super explicit, but it's in there.
Yeah, it's a really important point because the way I think we subconsciously all think about jobs to be done is knowing the job to be done is nice and naming it is fun. But jobs to be done is really so that we can kick off a design process to build something that is going to help you make progress. And so in many ways, design thinking talks about, need states, empathy, things like that. We think the job to be done is the entry point into that conversation. So then we can prototype and ultimately build something that helps you make progress. And it's why the prototyping is so, so important for this to work. And I was literally coaching a student of mine last night on the phone, and she was walking through what really drives her and the things that she thought she wanted to go do when she got to school here. I teach at the ed school at Harvard. And I said, what I think has happened is your mind is blown open with a bunch of possibilities. We now need to create some prototypes so you can really test these before we even make any conclusions about what you ought to be looking at next.
This was one of my greatest ahas from our work. And it's all credit to Bob. Because at one point I said, but every time you ask a person, what do you want to do next? They seem incapable of really specifying. And part of our book assumes that at some point they'll be able to do that. And Bob said, well, if you ask a person who's trying to develop a product to develop the best product, they'll just be stuck. If you ask them to create 3 or 5 prototypes, they'll go to work. Why isn't it the same for people? And it turns out that's really good advice.
And one of the things that I learned reading this was when we're doing jobs to be done, we're often trying to develop empathy with a customer. We're trying to understand what they want to get done. Well, we need to do that with ourselves. In this case, we're designing a product for ourselves, and our employers need to understand what we discover. And so it's a weird thing. And I think it's unique, actually, to this. Is it unique to this product? Not really. I think with all products, I'm going to take it apart. Is it unique to this product? Not in the sense that the buyer needs to understand what they want. That's not unique. And it's not unique in the sense that the designer of the product needs to know what they want. This is just particularly co-created because there's a way in which each job is bespoke.
Yeah, there's a much tighter feedback loop, right? Between the manager, the individual organization. These are people that are in regular communication with each other. So the ability to co-create almost real time is significantly higher than I think most other places we've applied this. And what I think is interesting is that so the next step is converging into the prototype, that you say, this is the 1 or 2 things that I really think could be a great match for the progress that I want to make. And as you go through that convergent process, and we really spend a lot of time on it because we help people make trade-offs. And Ethan loves saying this is not a book about the dream job that is perfect in every way. This is a book about making trade-offs because every job has its parts that are going to be difficult or not drive your energy. And we want you to pick those intentionally so that you can get all the benefits on the other side and really make progress. And so we help you do that very intentionally as you converge. And I'll race through the other steps because I want to make the point that you're honing in on, which is then we teach you how to search on the supply side, as we put it, for these potential jobs. But what we really then lean into is how to tell your story and how to really distill what you've learned about yourself, the quest that you're on, into a 1-page cheat sheet or user guide that can really communicate this effectively. And what we've seen over and over again, one of the protagonists in the book experiences this, but we've actually seen this now several times since, is when you're able to help your manager see the process you've been through and what you've learned about the progress you're seeking to make. A lot of times they say, hold the presses. We can step outside of the normal bounds and create that job for you here. No move required, right? Because we've been looking for someone to do A, B, and C. We never thought it would be coupled with D, E, and F that you're bringing to the table, but we really need that. How do we make this work together?
What is interesting to me about that, I used to teach this when I taught writing at the University of Colorado. I would teach my students, words suck. They're really not very good. And I had a series of actually classes on this. And one of the things that happens is that whenever we write something down, it gets small. And that's a bit of what you're saying about a job description or something like that. And what we're trying to get here is whole human to whole human communication that might not be transcribable.
I have to jump in here back on the theoretical geeking out piece of this, because when you said words suck, this is actually really the basis of the jobs to be done interview protocol, which is to say, someone says, oh, that experience was good. What the heck does good mean? Is it good like apple pie or is it good like a Ferris wheel? We really need to understand and unpack these things. And people use words all the time that mean something specific to them, although they don't often know what it means to them. We have to help them, but also, frankly, to us. And one of the challenges that our third co-author, Bob, has with naming the quests or the jobs to be done is the moment you name it, get out, regain alignment, regain control, that means something to someone. And it does lose the complexity of all these underlying pushes and pulls that are in anyone's given quest.
Let me be more explicit in that. You have more than 30 things that people might look for as a push or a pull in their lives. So to condense them into a single quest points toward those things, but could potentially oversimplify them.
Yes. And that's why they're not categorical.
Right. They're not categorical. And it's also why you describe it as something that is not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing activity. This reminds me a little bit of Bill Burnett and Designing Your Life, who was on the show. And that there's prototyping that you're talking about is I'm going to come up with ideas of the prototype. A part of what they talk about there is test them. Don't just write them down. Be curious, try them out.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly important part of the process is to test it out. And we hope we've given people some ways to do so through a very different informational interview, for example, against the things that you're prioritizing, as well as, frankly, all the ideas that people who are not us have thought about over time, right? Through taking a gig, doing a side job, getting an internship, shadowing. So, like, there's lots of ways, right, to prototype work before you make the big switch to say, today's the day I'm quitting and I'm going to go do this. Lots of people have pointed out how important it is to test these futures. And again, it's something that I know Ethan does this with his students as well. I'm constantly with my students. Before you say, I'm going to graduate and this is the thing, if you have 3 hypotheses for what you want to do next, how do we get you real experience to really understand how does this line up?
And our other solution, this is right out of David Opsfield's world. So this is a preview, Dart, for your session to come, is to make this process social. If there were one thing I would hope this book would do, it's give people a common language and an established process that expects people to use mentorship and managers and people they know to bounce ideas and engage in activities that are social. Because if you have an idea of what it is you want to do in your mind and you don't share it with others, if you have a push or a pull that you're experiencing that you don't share with your manager, if your manager has a list of pushes and pulls, which they now do, and they don't use that as the basis of a conversation with you about how you're feeling about your current role and what you might be thinking about in terms of making progress next, then it all just stays inside and then we're still not matching well. The progress really, it does come from it being social.
I would love to ask you, because you're so much in the same world, some of the frequently asked questions that I get when I speak on this topic and see how you answer them. Because here's one. Look, employees are really important, but if we focus too much on the inside of the company, we're not going to be really focusing on the customer, and we're just not going to win if we do that. And so I just don't think this is the most important thing.
I've heard various versions of this, and usually it involves a citation to a generation whose letter might be at the end of the alphabet. We're actually not asking managers or organizations to spend much more time, maybe not any more time than they already do. If you consider the time and investment involved in bringing new people in replacing people when they leave, in retaining them and having perpetual conversations about how much more money or whatever we might put at them just to keep them around for 4 or 6 months, the investment is huge. This is not a large investment. In fact, of the chapters, all but 2 are for the individual. So most of the ask that we're making is of individuals, not of the organization. If that work is done, then the work of the manager is actually relatively straightforward. And we haven't run into a lot of managers who think it's outsized relative to what they're doing today. In fact, if they had the support of a strategic HR unit behind them to help track the results of these conversations and make progress and trajectories more transparent over time, we might actually be asking people to spend less time, not more, because they're just doing it in a smarter way.
There's something that you said in one of your interviews, which was that HR is a partner to this process, but it's not necessarily at this time equipping managers to have this kind of a conversation.
I think that's right, Dart, is that we talked earlier about the artifacts of jobs and things like that, and they're supporting things for the organization. I often think about them as managing risk for the organization, but not necessarily helping managers with these very human strategic questions. And that's not to say individual HR managers don't do that. They do. But as a matter of process and technologies and tools, there's less on that emphasis. And it's often, look, the technology tools, we ladder positions, right? We title them and we grade them, and that helps us understand where they sit in the org chart and how much money they can or cannot get and things like that. And all of these artifacts sometimes work against that enterprising manager who says, oh, well, this is the progress Ethan's trying to make. If I can just snap that little thing over here to that, he can continue to grow, make progress. And wow, that's a real priority for my team. That's a real win. But it does step outside of the following three things, right, that are designed as processes from HR. And whew, that's going to be a big headache. And so I think our push there is, how do we help HR to start to line up through these language, if you will, so that some of these conversations that we know are happening anyway can happen less on an ad hoc basis and more with structure behind them around what individuals are trying to do. Because we as you really flip this on its head, right? Most people, when they look at this market, they think of humans, people, as the supply side and organizations as the demand side. We're flipping this. We're saying, no, the people are the demand side and the organizations are the supply side. And so as a result of that, we think you got to understand what the demand side really wants if you hope to achieve your ends.
Well, that is so much better than I say it. I love that. That's great.
It's great to have a great co-author.
I was going to say I made my way there, but
I'm going to ask a couple more, and then we're going to go to closing questions. It goes like this. Look, seriously, employees are already entitled enough. If I start treating them like customers, won't that get worse?
This is the Wagyu beef, Ethan. Go for it.
So I was in a room with a wonderful set of executives, of senior leaders of a top organization. And I give huge credit to one of them for standing up at one point and saying, I am so tired of this generation expecting me to massage them like Wagyu beef. And I'm grateful to her because that's how it feels, isn't it? It feels as if they feel entitled to these conversations. Now, again, I'll remind you, all but 2 chapters of this book are their work, not managers' work. But this question and the previous one actually, to me, have a similar nature to them. We're pointing fingers. Managers are pointing fingers at HR saying, well, HR isn't helping me do this and will keep me from being able to do it. And pointing fingers at the employee saying the employee isn't telling me what she wants. Am I supposed to be the therapist here and just like pull it out of her? Whereas the employee is pointing at the manager and saying, well, the manager doesn't seem to care about me. Manager cares more about the organization, and pointing fingers at HR saying, HR is not really supporting me. They're just giving me the menu of options that I don't want. And HR is pointing at the manager and saying, the manager won't have these conversations. And the employee is saying, the employee's not telling me what they're actually expecting until they leave. And even then, they don't typically do so because exit interviews don't reveal very much about people at all. And anytime you see 3 parties pointing fingers at each other like this, saying one is more entitled or less entitled than they ought to be, I think it's typically a common language problem. There just isn't enough common language to have the conversation that matters, because I actually believe all 3 of those parties are doing their very best most of the time for the organization and for the individuals.
Just to pile on that for a moment, Dart, something else that Clay taught us was people generally don't do stupid things because they're stupid people, but because they're stuck in situations and organizations with processes that compel them to act stupidly, shall we say. And when I hear Ethan talk through that, I think that's part of the equation here, isn't it? Is that we have rigid things that are decoupled from the situations that we're in fact experiencing and that make it feel like we're headbutting each other. But something else that I've learned through this, and is really relevant in my world, because I think a lot about the fast shrinking shelf life of skills, is that if we're yelling at Gen Z constantly, technical skills are eroding faster than ever. You're out of date the moment you come out of school. You have 4 years at most to make an impact with the skill set. No wonder they're impatient. No wonder they're grasping, I have to have impact now and you better give me the kingdom. And I think something else that we take away from this is actually, if we can reset it around this new language, that what they're asking is not as big as it's sounding to the manager on the other side.
Right. And it's partially because they might be asking for features when in fact we could take a step back and we could talk about experiences and break it into sub pieces.
100%, right? The artifacts are the free lunches, the this, the that. That's not really what they're asking for.
No, it's not. That's the box we're comes in, is the way I describe that. So I ask a few closing questions at the end of every show. You are two of the three most prepared people to answer these questions I've ever spoken to.
Uh-oh.
Ooh, the expectations just went up.
Ethan, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
I am here at the Harvard Business School because I love the research and I love the colleagues, but I particularly love the classroom. And so the job that I hired the Harvard Business School to do is to bring me back into a classroom in which I was once a student and allow me to continue to learn from my students, with my students, and make progress, the kind of progress that we show every day as I pull up the piece of chalk and write on the chalkboard. We have these discussions, and each time I learn something, and I hope they learn something, about a business situation, a key dilemma in organizations around the world that makes us all a little bit better as managers and might make those organizations better as well.
Very clearly spoken. Normally I would dig on that, but because we've got both of you, I'm going to move on to Michael. Michael, what do you hire your job to do for you?
So I have a portfolio of gigs that I stitch together because the work that I want to do is to help build a world in which all individuals can build their passions and fulfill their potential. So the different parts of my life, the speaking, the writing, the teaching, all come together to try to paint a picture of where we can go as a society and as organizations to facilitate that for individuals.
Now, Clay Christensen, in his milkshake lecture, explained that people don't hire a milkshake. They hire it for a lot of things, but one is to keep them from being bored while they're commuting to work, things like that. But he also said that there are other things that they turn to that are not milkshakes, that actually do the same job, just not as well. I'm going to ask this of both of you at the same time because you may not both have answers, but for both of you, what's the Snickers bar or the donut or the bagel and cream cheese that you turn to that's not your main job, or that you might turn to do the same thing, to get the same job done?
I'll say up front, this is why I have a portfolio of gigs in part, is because I like to switch constantly how I have that lens. I will tell you, I learned during the pandemic. So I was spending a lot of time before the pandemic with an education venture studio where we got to create education for-profits and not-for-profits in the post-secondary and upskilling space. And one of the companies we had first invested in is this company, Guild Education, that upskills frontline employees. And they acquired their investor, us, which was very strange. And I went in full time there for a couple years as we started this real deep dive on the research, which was great at the moment because I had access to a lot of adults trying to make progress in their careers. But what I learned through that process, and I think it'll answer your question, Dart, is while I could hire something on the ground to help me make progress, I actually think my unique value add is at the 25,000 foot level and not in the weeds. I like speaking across the sector or sectors that people think are different, but I see them as one system and not getting into the weeds of management and things like that. I used to love doing that. When I built the Christensen Institute, I loved that. But when my twin daughters were born, I wanted to regain control in how my time was used. And that was one of my observations or realizations about myself.
So I'll tell you a little bit of an inside story here that's not so inside because it's on one of the very first pages of the book. So we've dedicated this book to all the individuals struggling to make progress in their careers now and in the future, including those in our homes and hearts. And among those are the names of our children, the last two of which are Covell, who has seen me teach. And once upon a time when he was young and had gone in my classroom and someone asked him what Daddy does at work, he went to his little chalkboard at home, took out a piece of chalk and made a tapping sound as if it were chalk on that chalkboard. And Clayton, who has borrowed the name from Clayton Christensen, and so that final name is starred and says, including both Claytons, small and tall. And so when I'm not enjoying the space in which I used to be around the tall Clayton, I take my professorial self home to the small ones. I can't say that they're always thrilled with that. But when I am not hiring the job of professor at the Harvard Business School, I am hiring the job of parent at home as a teacher of a different kind.
I'll tell you, I almost want to end on that story because it is such a nice story. I'm incredibly envious that both of you got to work with Clayton Christensen. I didn't even know that was possible, honestly. Let me start with Michael this time. What does your job cost you?
My job costs me a couple things. One, while I have lots of control when I'm at home, I travel a lot to speak and so forth. And the costs are being away from my kids. And even, I was doing TV just a couple days ago, and I think my kids know this by now. I have 10-year-old twins. And even still, one of my daughters that night, just in hysterics, why is daddy gone? That is a huge cost from my perspective, particularly given how much I've engineered my life to be around them. And I think the impact for individuals, helping them build their passions and fulfill their potential. Something else Clay Christensen taught us was that work begins at home with the kids. And they don't only always produce the immediate feedback and returns and excitement and endorphins, but gosh, if you don't prioritize them, you'll really lose something in the long run. So I think that's the biggest cost of my current work.
When you asked that question, I immediately I had a flashback to 2007. Saturday morning, about 6:30 in the morning, I got a phone call from Clay Christensen inviting me to join the doctoral program. I was at the time a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group. And Clay said, among other things, that they would pay me about enough to live in a shoebox in Boston, but I would be fulfilled in many other ways. So there is that. There is that cost, I suppose. But I will also say this is now 2024. That was 2007. And I am at the moment in the process whereby I have my tenure packet in and being evaluated for tenure at the Harvard Business School. That is a long journey. There was a lot of work and at times stress involved in that process. It is not a riskless endeavor, academia. And so that's the cost that I would highlight, perhaps because it is so close to me, literally, in time.
Thank you very much for coming on the show today. It has been an absolute delight talking to both of you. Where can people learn more about you and your book? And by the way, I see you have the book, like the physical book. I have galleys. So the physical book exists, but I don't think it's out at the time of this recording. It'll probably be out by the time this drops.
That's correct, yeah. So the physical book will be out in bookstores, Amazon, everywhere on November 19th. So if you're listening after November 19th, 2024, it is out in the wild. Ethan and I now have copies at last, but it'll be widely distributed soon. You can find out more about the book at jobmoves.com. There are a whole host of free resources and assessments around what quest you're on to help you in your path. And then I'm at michaelbhorn.com and at Substack, and all the social media channels is the best way to find me.
And you can find me at the letter E at hbs.edu.
So it's just the initial E.
At hbs.edu, indeed.
At hbs.edu. Well, that's nice. That's a nice link. I will just tell all my listeners, this is a very readable book. And a part of the reason is that it takes as a case study all the way through. It follows one person who's Clara and uses her as an example, but then blows out into the research at each step. And so very, very readable book, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts, and share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.